The ring sat in a glass dish on Lady Fernwood's dressing table, third from the left among 6 others, and Cecily Hart had known it the moment she saw it. She had not been looking for it. She had been carrying fresh linens up the servants' stair of Ashfield Park, her arms full of folded holland cloth, the rough canvas apron tied at her waist, catching at the banister, when a parlor maid named Dolly had called to her from Lady Fernwood's open chamber door. One of the older women was ill with a head cold, and would Cecily step in to lay out the evening things? Cecily had said yes. She had crossed the threshold, set the linens down, and stood before the dressing table to sort through what garments the maid had already pressed. And there it was. A small oval signet in rose gold, the face cut with a Tudor rose, the inner band worn thin from 30 years on her mother's finger. Her mother had never removed it. Not once in all Cecily's childhood. Not in the garden. Not in the kitchen. Not during fever. It had been on her mother's hand the morning she died. Cecily had last seen it when the undertaker came. That was 14 months ago. She had stood at the dressing table for a full minute before she permitted herself to breathe. She had smoothed the gown she held, hung it at the press, and straightened each item with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a woman who had learned to move as though no one was watching, even when someone might be. Then she had gone back to her own work. Because to take the ring then, in a room she had entered without prior arrangement, before she understood how it had arrived at Ashfield Park, would have been foolish. And whatever else she had become in 14 months, Cecily Hart was not foolish. She had been a great many things before this. The daughter of Mr. Charles Hart of Dunmore, a gentleman of modest income and large learning. She had grown up in a house full of books and short of fires, educated past her station, and possessed of the kind of mind that had made her father proud, and the county quietly uncomfortable. When the income had stopped, she had known it would. The entail was iron. The cousin had arrived within a fortnight of the funeral, and within a month, Cecily had written to the agency in Bath and accepted the first respectable position offered, needlework assistant and occasional reader, to Lady Fernwood of Ashfield Park, Wiltshire. A thin title. The work of a gentlewoman at reduced wages, which was to say that she was required to wear the cap and the apron and to enter by the servants' door, while being expected to decline any familiarities that servants were permitted. The ring had not been among her mother's things when Cecily packed the house. She had turned every drawer, every jewel case, every pocket of every coat. It was not there. She had assumed it stolen, and she had filed the assumption away as one of the losses that a woman without legal claim to anything could not pursue. She had carried her trunk down to the hired coach and not looked back at the house. That had been October. This was December. The first ball of the Ashfield winter season was 2 days hence, and the household ran at the particular pitch of agitated preparation that made everyone careless and no one accountable. Cecily understood that this was the window, and she intended to use it. What she had not accounted for was the Earl of Denmore. She had seen him twice since her arrival at Ashfield Park, once at a distance crossing the South Park on horseback and once in the library, where he had come in without announcement, and she had been too deep in the estate ledgers she had been asked to check for Lady Fernwood to hear him enter. He had stood a moment before he said, in a voice that carried no particular warmth, that he had documents for the East Shelf, and she need not move. She had not moved. He had placed his papers and gone. That was September. She had taken nothing from the encounter except an impression, a man of perhaps 34, a face that might have been handsome if it had learned to arrange itself differently, and the quality of absolute stillness she had seen in men who had suffered some private ruin and decided not to speak of it. His name was Hugh Marvell, Lord Denmore, and he was Lady Fernwood's nephew, and the only legitimate heir to the Ashfield entail after the old lord's death the previous spring. The household deferred to him in all things. Lady Fernwood tolerated this with the composure of a woman who had spent 30 years learning which battles to wage and which to lose. To the upper servants, she was just the needlework girl, useful and forgettable. That description had come from Mr. Purvis, the house steward. During her first week, he had been summarizing her duties to the footman responsible for her tray, and he had not lowered his voice because she was not, in his reckoning, the kind of person whose hearing required consideration. She had let it stand. It was not the last time she would hear it. The ball was on Friday. Lady Fernwood wore diamonds and her late husband's rubies, and moved through the assembled company of 34 guests with the satisfaction of a woman receiving what she was owed. The ring was still in the dish on the dressing table. Cecily had confirmed it that morning, lingering at the door on the pretext of returning a mended glove. She chose midnight. The family and guests would be at supper until at least 11, and the upper housemaids had their own observances on ball nights that kept them below stairs until the small hours. The middle stair was dark and familiar. Cecily had committed it to her feet over the course of 3 months, the way one commits a text to memory. The second step creaking on the right side. Fifth does not creak at all. The landing smells of beeswax and the roses Lady Fernwood insisted on, even in December. She was 3 steps from Lady Fernwood's door when the door at the end of the corridor opened. The Earl of Denmore stood in the doorway of his study with a candle. He was still in his evening clothes, the coat thrown back, the cravat loosened, and he looked at her across 20 feet of dark corridor with the expression of a man cataloguing a problem. She stood where she was, because to bolt was to admit she had something to hide, and she had made it this far on the strength of never showing precisely what she was thinking. "Miss Hart," he said. He had learned her name, then. "My lord." He looked at her apron and her candle and the direction she was facing. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It is past midnight." "I am aware of that, my lord." "Are you retrieving something?" The question was plain and direct, and she answered it plainly, because she had discovered in the 14 months since her father died that the kind of prevarication she had once thought protective tended to collapse under any real pressure, and she would rather choose the terms of a difficult conversation than have them chosen for her. She said, "I believe so, my lord. With your permission." If that surprised him, he did not show it. He said, "Come in, explain." She followed him into the study. It was a cold room, smelling of old paper and the remnant of a fire not recently tended, and he set his candle on the desk and stood behind it with his arms at his sides, which was not the posture of a man about to be generous, but was the posture of a man who intended to hear her out. She told him about the ring. She told him all of it. Her mother, the Tudor rose, the morning of the death, the undertaker, the missing inventory. She told him when she had first seen it on the dressing table, and she told him that she had not taken it then because she did not yet know how it had arrived at Ashfield Park. She told him she had spent the subsequent weeks learning that a woman named Mrs. Bray, who had been hired to close up the Dunmore house after the cousin took possession, was a second cousin of Lady Fernwood's lady's maid, and that Mrs. Bray had helped herself to several small items she judged unlikely to be missed by a young woman going into service. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Can you prove the ring was your mother's?" "My father's letters name it," she said. He described it in 3 separate letters over the course of their correspondence before marriage. Rose gold, oval, Tudor rose face, inner band engraved with the initials EVH for her maiden name. Eleanor Violet Hart. I have copies of the letters. He looked at her for a moment with that same cataloging attention. Where are the originals? In the cousin's keeping, I would imagine. I have no legal claim to them. I made my own copies before leaving the house. She held his gaze and did not add that she had sat up 3 nights in a row to do so, by a candle stub not much larger than the one on his desk, in a room already being measured for the cousin's effects. She did not say this because it was not the relevant detail. The relevant detail was that she had the copies. He pulled out the chair from behind his desk and sat in it. It was not an offer to sit, and she did not sit. He said, "Why not come to me directly?" "I considered it," she said. "You do not know me. I have been in this house 3 months. You would have had to take my word against the established order of things. And I am—" She paused a fraction of a second, not from uncertainty, but from the small, dry discipline of choosing the precise phrase. The needlework girl. Something shifted in the line of his jaw. Not warmth, exactly. A different kind of attention. "My aunt's maid," he said slowly, "has been with her 22 years. "I know. That is a considerable complication." "I know that too," Cecily said. She stood very still with her hands folded at her waist, not because she was not afraid, but because she had learned the difference between composure and calm, and had been making do with the former for 14 months. "I was not planning to bring the complication to anyone. I was planning to retrieve the ring quietly and not speak of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "And the maid, and your claim to the ring, and the question of how it left the Dunmore house. You were planning simply not to speak of any of it." "Yes. That is an incomplete plan. I am aware of that as well." She took one breath and looked at him directly. It was the best available plan for a woman with no legal standing in this house, in any house, no male relative to act on her behalf, no resources, and one specific thing she wanted back. I did not need justice. I needed the ring. She had not meant it as a speech. It was not one. It was the least she could say and have him understand the situation's actual dimensions, and she had said it because it was true, and because she was tired, and because the candle on the desk was guttering, and she did not know how much longer she could stand in this particular room being measured. Something she could not identify moved across his face. Then he looked away from her, at his desk, at his hands. He said in a different register, "My wife's ring was taken from her jewel case by a woman she trusted. The woman sold it. It could not be recovered." Cecily did not say she was sorry. She understood instinctively that this was not a confidence being shared in search of consolation, and she honored the difference. She said nothing. He stood up from the desk. He said, "Go to your room. Leave the ring where it is tonight." Her chest contracted. She kept her face still. "In the morning," he said, "I will speak to my aunt. I will do this with you present, not behind your back. You will not be required to accuse anyone. You will be required to present your letters to me beforehand, which I will review tonight. Bring them now, then go to your room." She understood what he was offering, and she understood the cost of it to him, and she understood that she could refuse it. He had no leverage over her decision. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly proper, and then she crossed to the desk and set down her candle and opened the small pocket she had sewn into her apron lining, which had held the copied letters since the first morning she had seen the ring, because she was not foolish. She had prepared for a great many contingencies. The Earl of Denmore had not been among them. He took the letters without looking at her and set them on the desk, and she took back her candle and went to her room. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark of the small chamber under the eaves and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about the expression on his face when she had said the needlework girl. Not pity. Nothing so easy as pity. Something that had recognized the phrase and its function, and declined to pretend it was something other than what it was. She thought about his wife's ring. She thought about the particular quality of a loss that cannot be recovered. She thought that she had made a very serious error of judgment somewhere in the evening, and she could not locate it precisely, and that uncertainty was more frightening to her than anything that had yet occurred. The night passed. The house reassembled itself around the ordinary machinery of a December morning. At 9 o'clock she was admitted to Lady Fernwood's morning room, where Lady Fernwood sat at her correspondence, and Lord Denmore stood at the window with the copied letters in his hand. Lady Fernwood looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been unexpectedly required to reconsider, which is a look Cecily had seen before, and knew to be more dangerous than open hostility. Open hostility could be answered. Reconsideration moved on its own schedule. Lord Denmore spoke. He spoke quietly, and with what Cecily would later understand was the particular precision of a man who had learned to present an argument without inflection, so that no one in the room could claim to have been bullied. He named the ring. He named the letters and what they described. He named Mrs. Bray and the connection to the lady's maid. He said that he would send to the solicitor in Bath to obtain confirmation of the inventory discrepancy. Lady Fernwood said, with the composure of a woman who had survived worse, that she had never examined the ring's provenance and had no reason to suppose it anything other than a legitimate acquisition through the maid's family. This was almost certainly true, and it was also a statement that had been chosen for its accuracy rather than for its warmth. Lord Denmore said, "Then the matter is straightforward. The ring was not legitimately for sale, and the acquisition, however innocent, should be corrected." Lady Fernwood looked at Cecily. She said, in a voice that carried no particular feeling, "You are the needlework girl." Cecily met her eyes and said, "I am Charles Hart's daughter." It was not defiance. It was a statement of fact offered with the same precision she had heard in Lord Denmore's voice, and she did not look away. And Lady Fernwood did not reply immediately, and the morning room held a brief silence that was doing a great deal of work. Lord Denmore crossed to the table where the glass dish from Lady Fernwood's dressing room had been placed. She had not asked how it came to be there, and he took the ring up and held it out to Cecily without ceremony. She took it. It was lighter than she remembered, and heavier than the past 14 months. She said, "Thank you, my lord." He said, "Your letters, Miss Hart," and returned them to her. And she put both the ring and the letters into her apron pocket, and stood there in Lady Fernwood's morning room in the canvas apron and the plain cap, and did not cry, because she had decided some months ago that she would not cry about things until they were over, and nothing was over yet. Lady Fernwood said, when Cecily had gone, that the girl had a great deal of nerve. Lord Denmore said that the girl had a great deal of everything else as well, and went back to the window. Lady Fernwood understood, from 30 years of reading men in this family, that the conversation had taken a turn she had not been watching for, and she filed that understanding away with the care of a woman who knew better than to voice it aloud. December deepened. The guests departed after the ball, 1 or 2 by 1 or 2, and Ashfield Park returned to its winter pitch of quiet formality. Cecily wore the ring on the inner side of her left hand, turned so the Tudor rose faced her palm, and no one commented on this, which she understood to mean that one of the 2 people in the house who had noticed it had decided not to remark upon it. She was reading aloud to Lady Fernwood when it happened, 10 days after the morning room. Cowper's poems, which Lady Fernwood preferred in the morning when her head was clear, and Cecily had her place marked and was moving through a passage of particular tenderness when she became aware of Lord Denmore in the doorway. She continued reading. He did not enter. After a moment, Lady Fernwood said, without turning, that he might as well come in, and he crossed the room and took the chair opposite the fire and stayed there, which he had not done before during her reading hours. She finished the passage and closed the book and asked Lady Fernwood whether she should continue or stop. Lady Fernwood said, with a particular precision, to stop. Cecily rose and went to the shelves to replace the volume, and Lord Denmore said, from behind her, "Miss Hart, the passage on the robin. Read that one." She turned. He was looking at the fire. She opened the book again and found the passage and read it, standing at the shelves, and the room was very quiet. When she finished, he said, "Thank you." And she said, "You are welcome, my lord." And Lady Fernwood said nothing, and the fire said everything. He began finding reasons to be in the rooms she occupied. It was not abrupt, not pressing, and she recognized the quality of it. Precisely because she had learned to read the understated language of a man who moved as though the next action might be recalled at any moment. He asked her once what she was reading on her own account. She told him, Cowper, and a borrowed volume of Boethius that Mr. Purvis had given her with some embarrassment, and the estate ledgers when she had occasion, which she knew was irregular. He had said, at that last admission, nothing. But a week later she found on the table in the outer library a clean copy of the most recent year's accounts, with a note that said only, "Should you find any errors, the steward would welcome the correction." It was signed HMD. She found 3 errors. She corrected them in the margins in pencil, anonymously, and returned the volume to the table. The next morning there was a second volume and a small pot of fresh ink. If Lady Fernwood observed any of this, she kept her observations in the place where Regency women of her experience kept things that were not yet ready to be named. It was the matter of her mother's ring that opened the wound she had not expected. She had thought retrieving the ring would close something, and instead it had opened a seam she had not known was there. The place where her mother had been, and was now absent. The place where the house in Dunmore had stood, and was now the cousin's. She had thought herself past the worst of it. She had been wrong. She was in the outer library alone when Lord Denmore came in, and found her not reading and not crying, but sitting in the chair with her hand closed around the ring, and the particular stillness of a person holding themselves at a distance from something large. He did not ask what was wrong. He sat in the opposite chair and said nothing. After a while he said, her name, which was the first time he had used it, and the word landed in the room with a weight she was not ready for, and she looked up. He said, I know what it is to hold a thing that should have been kept safe, and was not. She understood that he was not speaking only of her ring. She said, Your wife? And he said, Yes. And they sat in the outer library for a long time with the candles burning down, and the weight of other people's absences filling the room around them, and it was the most honest conversation she had ever had with anyone, though neither of them said anything that could be directly quoted. He had been married 4 years. His wife had died of a fever in the 3rd year, before the child she carried had reached its full term. He had not spoken of it to anyone in the household, not to Lady Fernwood, not to the steward, not to the man who had been his friend since school. He had closed the portrait and put away the piano, and stopped doing the things that reminded him of her, which meant he had stopped doing almost everything. And the household had read this as coldness and deferred to it accordingly. He did not say any of this aloud. Cecily was the daughter of a scholar, and she had learned to read the shape of what was not being said with the same attention she gave to what was. And she understood it. What she understood further, sitting in the chair with the ring in her closed hand, was that she had made a worse error of judgment than she had identified before. She had come to Ashfield Park to survive, and instead she had begun, in some quiet subterranean way she had not given permission for, to want things again. Specific things. The corrected ledgers. The Cowper passage read in a room where someone heard it. The weight of a ring on her palm that meant her mother had been real and had been loved. She had not given permission for this. Lord Denmore looked at her, and she looked at him, and the fire settled in the grate. He said, after a long pause, "I have said very little that was true to anyone in this house for the better part of 2 years." She said, "I have said almost nothing at all that was not strategically designed to get me through the next fortnight." He did not smile. Something in his face loosened fractionally, which was not the same as smiling, but was, for him, the equivalent. He said, "You are the most careful person I have encountered in a very long time." She said, "You are the first person who has seen that without finding it inconvenient." The fire had burned low by the time she stood to go. He rose as she did, which was the sort of social reflex she had not expected, and he stood in the outer library holding a candle and looking at her with an expression she did not have a category for. If you have stayed with this story until now, I am grateful. What comes next is where it turns. She spent the following 3 days avoiding the library. It was not cowardice, she told herself, and then reconsidered, because she had also decided some months ago to be honest about the category she was placing a given behavior in. It was caution. She was a woman without legal standing, without family, without income sufficient to sustain her if she left Ashfield Park. And she was allowing herself to believe things about a man she had no reasonable basis for allowing herself to believe. She was also allowing herself to feel things that had no practical application, which was worse. The difficulty was that her body did not accept these arguments. Her body had its own reckoning, and it had been conducting it for some weeks, and it was far ahead of her rational assessment. She knew when he entered a room before she saw him, a displacement of warmth and attention she could not suppress, her pulse adjusting as though to a barometric shift. When he had said her given name in the outer library, the warmth had risen to the surface of her skin and stayed there for a full minute. These were facts. She had catalogued them with the same precision she brought to the ledger columns, and they were as reliable. On the 4th day, he asked Lady Fernwood, within Cecily's hearing, whether Miss Hart might be spared to walk the East Park with him to look at the beach boundary where the fencing needed assessment. Lady Fernwood said, with a composure that did not quite conceal the satisfaction behind it, that she supposed so. He did not touch her in the East Park. He walked at the proper distance, perhaps a foot more than the proper distance, with his hands behind his back, and they walked the full length of the beach boundary, and he asked her opinion of the fencing layout, and she gave it, which was not the kind of thing a man generally asked a woman. And she suspected he knew it, and had asked it deliberately. They reached the far end of the boundary, and stood looking back at the house, its gray stone softened by the thin winter light. And he said, "This is a good house when there are people in it who are not performing." She said, "Most houses are." He turned to look at her. He said, "Cecily." She looked at him. He was very close, closer than she had realized, the breath of the cold air between them, and she felt the pull as a physical fact, a leanward movement of everything in her that she arrested with the same deliberate effort one uses to hold a cup steady. He said, "I am not practiced at this." She said, "Neither am I." He said, "I have been thinking about the conversation in the library every day since it occurred, and I would like to have more of them." She looked at the gray house and the thin winter light and the beech trees standing at their boundary, and said with as much honesty as she had given him in the library, "So would I." He did not take her hand then, but the distance between them had changed in a way she could feel without measuring. A reduction to something that was neither the proper distance nor the improper one, but something new altogether. The difficulty, when it came, arrived wearing the face of social correctness. Lady Fernwood held a second gathering in January, smaller, more intimate, 6 guests from the county, and among them Miss Dorothea Payne, the daughter of a baronet of long Wiltshire tenure and a great deal of acreage to the south. Miss Payne was 23 and accomplished and possessed of the kind of beauty that the season had decided to approve, which was a different thing from the kind of beauty the season had decided not to see. She arrived with her mother, and her mother arrived with the settled patience of a woman who had been waiting for Lord Denmore to conclude his mourning, and was now prepared to apply the appropriate social pressure. Cecily understood the situation the first evening at dinner, where she was present in her capacity as reader and assistant to Lady Fernwood, and was placed correctly at the foot of the table with Mr. Purvis. She watched Miss Payne be situated at Lord Denmore's right hand, where she was gracious and intelligent and careful, and she watched the way Mrs. Payne managed the table with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this before. She watched Lord Denmore be precisely courteous, which told her very little, because he was precisely courteous to everyone. She watched and said nothing, and went to her room and sat with the ring in her palm for a long time. Mrs. Payne had come to Lady Fernwood's sitting room on the second morning with her daughter, and Cecily had been at her needlework in the window seat. Mrs. Payne had said, in a voice of pleasant social observation, that the girl was a useful addition to the household, and Lady Fernwood had agreed, and they had moved to the more interesting subject of Miss Payne's musical accomplishments and her prospects for the season. Cecily had kept her eyes on her work. Useful addition to the household. She had heard it. Lady Fernwood had not corrected the phrasing, and Cecily had turned it over later in the way one examines a thing that might be merely awkward or might be a declaration. It was at dinner on the third evening that Lord Denmore said, across the table, "Miss Hart." She looked up. The table was in full conversation, and she had not expected to be addressed from his end of it. She said, "My lord," and the table did not quiet, but something shifted in the attention of the people nearest her. He said, "I believe you mentioned the east boundary required a drainage survey as well as fencing." She said, "I noted it in the ledger margin." "Yes." He said, "I should like to walk it again when the ground softens. Would you be available to accompany me on the survey?" The table had quieted now. Miss Payne held her glass without raising it. Mrs. Payne's composure did not flicker, which spoke to her experience. Lady Fernwood looked at the flowers in the middle of the table as though they had become newly interesting. Cecily said, "Yes, my lord. I would be glad to." He nodded and returned to his conversation. The table reassembled itself. The exchange had been entirely proper. It had also been entirely deliberate, and she knew it. And she sat with the specific sensation of a woman who has been claimed in a room that was not sure yet what it had witnessed. Mrs. Payne found occasion to speak to Cecily alone the following morning, on the stair. She did it with impeccable smoothness. She said that she had observed that Miss Hart was a person of some education, and, she thought, some sense. She said that she hoped Miss Hart would understand the complexities of a household like Ashfield Park and the requirements of a man in Lord Denmore's position. She said this without saying anything that was actionable, without any phrase that could be repeated at a disadvantage, and with the perfect composure of a woman who was confidently wrong and had never been successfully contradicted. Cecily let her finish. Then she said, "Mrs. Payne, the ring I am wearing was my mother's." She turned her hand so the Tudor rose faced outward, the rose gold warm against her finger. She wore it every day of her married life. My father gave it to her in their first year. It was taken from her at her death, without permission, and I have spent some effort recovering it. She met Mrs. Payne's eyes directly. I am not accustomed to losing what is mine. Mrs. Payne was quiet for a full moment. Then she said very carefully, "I see," and continued down the stair, and Cecily went up. The Paynes departed the following morning, earlier than planned. She was in the outer library, the window cold at her back, when Lord Denmore came in. She did not look up from the ledger page, not because she was not aware of him, but because she had learned in the preceding weeks that her awareness of him required containment. He stood for a moment at the door, and then crossed to the desk and sat in the opposite chair. He said, "You spoke to Mrs. Payne." "She spoke to me first," Cecily said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Cecily." She looked up. He said, "I am not practiced at speaking about things that matter to me, as I believe you have gathered. I should like to try, if you are willing." She looked at him across the ledger pages, the candles between them, the winter light behind her. She said, "I am generally willing to hear things that are true." He said, "I have been a long time alone in this house, and I have become accustomed to alone in the way that one becomes accustomed to cold. I had stopped noticing it. You arrived, and I began noticing it again, and that was not comfortable." He stopped. He was holding the corner of the desk very precisely, she saw, the way she held a cup when she needed something to steady. "I have been thinking about the surveying walks, and about the passage on the Robin, and about a woman who carries her mother's letters in an apron pocket because she is not foolish, and I have been thinking that I do not want to continue conducting my life at the minimum necessary level of feeling." She set down the ledger page. She said, "That is a very honest speech." He said, "It is the best I have." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face that had arranged itself into something she recognized now as not coldness but grief held at careful distance, and she felt the pull she had been containing for weeks, and decided quietly, with the same precision with which she had made every other decision in 14 months, not to contain it. She said, "I came here with one specific thing I wanted. I did not permit myself to want anything else, because wanting other things seemed both impractical and dangerous." She paused. "I was wrong about the impractical part. I am still somewhat uncertain about the dangerous part." He said, "What would help with the uncertainty?" She said, "More conversations in this library." And he said, "I can accommodate that." And the room was quiet in the way that rooms are when something that has been approaching for a long time has finally arrived. He crossed to her side of the desk. He held out his hand, which was not a romantic gesture in any extravagant sense, and was everything in the actual sense. And she put her hand in his, the ring between their palms, warm gold and old roses, and he looked at her the way she had looked at the ring when she first recovered it, with the particular attention of a person who has found something they had stopped expecting to find. He said her name, the full syllables of it, and it was the third time, and it was different from the first two. And she felt the difference in her throat and her pulse, and the exact place where her breath had been keeping itself careful for 14 months. She was still, very still, the way she had stood at a great many difficult thresholds over the preceding year. He said nothing further, which was correct, because the moment did not require words. When he finally spoke again, it was to say, "I would like with Lady Fernwood's awareness and your consent, to make my intentions clear in whatever form would be most useful to you," she said. "The form most useful to me would be one that does not require me to explain myself to Mr. Purvis." He looked at her with the fractional loosening of his face she had learned to read as the equivalent of a full expression in another person. He said, "I think we can manage that." Lady Fernwood was informed that evening, and she received the information with the composure of a woman who had seen the thing coming for 6 weeks and had been waiting for someone to name it. She said that Cecily Hart had Charles Hart's intelligence and Eleanor Hart's stubbornness, and that she supposed between the two qualities one arrived at something worthwhile. She said this not looking at Cecily directly, but at the fire, which was the Regency equivalent of a blessing. Mr. Purvis received the announcement with the rigid surface composure of a man reconfiguring his categories, and Cecily did not help him with this, and did not need to. The reading hours continued. The ledger corrections continued, now officially, with her name in the margin. The surveying walks continued in all weathers, and in February, when the ground softened enough for the drainage assessment, she stood in the East Park and pointed out 3 places where water was already pooling, and he made notes in the small book he carried and said, not looking up, that she was going to be a great deal of work. She said, "You are also going to be a great deal of work." And he said, "Yes," with the quality of voice that meant it was not a complaint. She married him in March, in the church at the edge of the Ashfield estate, a small ceremony with Lady Fernwood and a few county witnesses. She wore a cream gown that had been her mother's, let out at the waist and rehemmed, the fabric still holding the particular faint scent of lavender from the Dunmore House linen press. She wore the ring on her right hand at the ceremony and moved it afterward to her left. He stood at the church door when she arrived, not waiting with the sort of patience that has performed its patience, but present in the way he was present in a library or a survey walk or the outer library by candlelight, genuinely there in the room, attention fully committed. He looked at her with the same expression he had used in the East Park, the long cataloguing look, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. By that evening, Ashfield Park had a different quality in its rooms, or perhaps it was only that she heard it differently, the creak of the second stair and the smell of beeswax and the roses Lady Fernwood still insisted upon, all of it hers now in a specific legal sense that was also not the relevant sense. The relevant sense was the fire in the outer library, which burned longer now because the room was occupied more often, and the ledger on the desk with both their annotations in the margins, and the cowper on the shelf she had put there herself, and the piano in the south room, which had been uncovered in February without ceremony, and which she had found him sitting at one early morning not playing, but with his hand on the keys in the particular attitude of a person beginning to find their way back to something. She had stood in the doorway and not spoken. He had looked at her, and then at the keys. After a while he had played a few bars of something she did not know, tentatively, as one plays a thing long unpracticed. She had gone and sat in the chair by the window. He had continued. The ring on her left hand caught the morning light through the south windows, the Tudor rose throwing a small shadow across her knuckle. Her mother's ring on her mother's daughter's hand, in a room full of morning and old music, and the particular warmth of a house that had learned to be inhabited again. She turned it once, a small private motion, thumb over the worn gold of the inner band. Outside the south windows, the Ashfield Park lay under a light frost, the beeches at the boundary dark against a pale sky, the ground keeping its winter quiet. Inside the room, the fire had been freshly laid, and the music found its way through a passage that had been difficult before, and now was not. She did not name what she felt. She did not need to.